Okay, thank you very much, Katerina. Thanks everybody for taking some time out of your Wednesday morning or afternoon or wherever you are to learn a little bit about the metrics that matter in field service. And so a lot of what we're going to cover today is actually goes beyond just the scope of field service itself, but we're going to try to kind of keep it focused on, you know, operations out in the field and normally industrial and critical infrastructure use cases. So I will quickly just give an intro to myself so you know who you're listening to. So my name is Michael Sothin. I've been here at Zinier for about a year and a half, which is not so long, but in the course of about a 5-year company history, it's relatively long, but about 10 years in field service in one way or another. So in my former life, I was working more in workforce management from the security side and access control, especially with telecom infrastructure. For about 6 years across the world, from Asia to Latin America to Europe. But I also was involved in 2 startups related to field service management, one in the US, another one in Asia, and then also something kind of related to luggage storage and transport here. So all kind of with field service angles, whether it was commercial HVAC systems and smart filtration replacement systems, where we would take, for instance, using particulate counters, we'd actually measure the size and load of particulates in a system to see if we thought there was potentially bacteria inducing microbes passing through. So this was mainly for baked goods companies. And then we would actually automate the filter replacement of different types of air filters based off of that load count or particulate count in the HVAC system. So always something in my past 10 to 12 years related to field service. And that eventually brought me here today to oversee sales for Zinier here in Europe. So I'm based in sunny Lisbon, which is where we have our European hub office. And we're now also setting up another office in London as well as we speak. So that's a little bit about me. So let's jump right into it. So, okay, today we're going to be primarily talking about data and metrics and how it relates to you as field service managers, technicians, etc. So this is an interesting quote from a man named W. Edwards Deming. So this was right at the turn of the 20th century. And what he said was, "In God we trust, all others, they must bring data." And you can see that little image here on the left without data, you're just another person with an opinion. So everyone has opinions, but it's really about how do you back up those opinions with data. So this guy is actually an interesting figure. He studied mathematical physics. He developed the sampling techniques that are actually still used today by the US Department of the Census and the Bureau of Labor Statistics. But he's best known for his work after World War II, basically with the leaders of Japanese industry. So kind of rebuilding the Japanese economy. And a lot of that goes into, he made a book, which was called The New Economics for Industry, Government, and Education. And in this book, he was championing things like statistical process control and the work of a man named Walter Shewhart. I think it's pronounced Shewhart. And so he called this the Shewhart cycle. And that Shewhart cycle eventually evolved into the plan, do, check, act loop, which is pretty famous nowadays and used in what's known as continuous improvement. Right, so we're actually going to touch on that later in the presentation, but I thought it was fitting to kind of set things off with talking about this man and the importance of data over opinions. So now if we bring it back into the realm of field service and we fast forward another century into the future, if we look at just kind of the high level value chain of field service, we can see it's fairly complex. It's simple, but that simple is kind of illusory. So in each one of these nodes, it's very easy for things to go wrong, but it's also a great opportunity to collect really value-driving data. But the question is, are you collecting that data, and what are you doing with that data? So just in scheduling and dispatching, you might have 1,000 technicians that you need to schedule for work the next day. You need to take things into account like, what certifications do they have? Do they have the right parts and inventory available? What kind of driver's license do they have? Can they drive this type of truck? And speaking of which, what are the driving conditions going to look like tomorrow? Are they going to be at risk? But then you can also take things into account if you're a bit more progressive, like things like health, mental wellness of your people. Like, how are people feeling? You don't want people on the job visiting customers that are either sick or maybe not in a healthy mental state. There's so many different data points to take in. In most organizations, especially when they're just managed by a team of people in the back office, struggle to manage all that data and to take it all in and correlate it together to make the optimal decision every day, for every work ticket, for every type of job, right? But the more you can process that, whether it's through people or machines, the smarter decisions you can begin to make. And then you can start setting benchmarks. And then, after you have a baseline, you can see, hey, what is moving, what is moving the dial forward, what is the dial back, and make adjustments accordingly, which kind of goes into that idea of continuous improvement that, again, we're going to touch on. So all throughout the value chain, from the initial kind of project management, ticket creation, work order generation, to the actual scheduling and dispatching of tasks around that work order, to then the pre-service, which really means how does a technician know the asset he or she is going to be working on, if they have a user manual for that asset, what tools are going to be required for the job, and loading up the van correctly, maybe coordinating with the customer to make sure they get access to the facility, to the actual execution, which is the heart of field service, where you're actually conducting the work, which might involve different types of checklists and workflows, et cetera, to the reporting, which is a key piece that Zinier often focuses on, which is there's a lot of inefficiencies in manual data entry with reporting. And this is probably the optimal place where you can collect all of that data from your jobs and start to make, impactful decisions the next time around based off of the data that's in those reports. So it's critical to not lose that data, but to also not waste a bunch of time inputting that data, because that's valuable time taken away from your technician's day, right? So if we actually look at the metrics themselves, there's a lot. So this slide is crowded and dense and messy, and that's because there's the world of data analysis and tracking and metrics can be quite complicated and messy. It's really about where do you focus, which metrics matter the most. So some of these are agnostic, right? They don't necessarily have a lot to do with field service. Like customer acquisition costs can be anything. It could be if you're just managing a website, attrition rates, retention, referrals. This goes across all industries, all verticals. Now, some are more focused on actual service delivery and field service, things like first time fix rate, mean time to repair, mean time to complete. These are mission critical metrics, which often kind of serve as the North Star for most field service organizations. So we're going to touch on some of these today. We're going to ignore some that might be more generic or less critical, and kind of focus in on the ones that we think are the most important. So here we go. So what priorities matter to you, as business leaders, as leaders of field service organizations? What is the most critical? So I think everyone could agree that, increasing margins is a big point. So we know in a lot of these industries, we work with a lot of managed service providers, facility management companies. They're working on really razor thin margins. And so, just a little shift in the dial to cut operating costs can mean, a huge difference. It can be from negative EBITDA to positive EBITDA, right? So but to get there, you need to know what is costing you money. Where are the delays? Where are the inefficiencies, right? Then also increasing the capacity for new customers at a lower cost, right? So this goes back to customer acquisition costs. If you need to hire on 5 new guys to acquire 1 new customer, and the cost of that staff is actually more than what you're generating in the customer, well, it's just a matter of time until you're going to go out of business, right? So how can you do more with less and acquire more customers at lower operating costs? And then kind of the big one that puts it all together is, how do you increase customer satisfaction, right? So how do you deliver better service? How do you ensure that your customers are happy? So this deals with things like Net Promoter Score, CSAT, et cetera. So we're going to touch on these 3 points and a little bit more later today here. Now, this slide is fairly interesting. So this actually comes from McKinsey. So this is actually just to step back for one moment. This is the second part of a 4-part webinar series that we're doing here at Zinier in Europe, around kind of field service and automation. So the first part was a general kind of how can AI and automation be applied to field service, and it was pretty zoomed out, high level, bird's eye view. This one is getting a little deeper now, so we're talking about the metrics. And then next week we'll have another one covering scheduling and dispatching specifically, which is kind of the heart of how all field service begins. And then our final one will be on mobile management. So how do you actually manage and gain better visibility and efficiency of your technicians in the field when they're executing service, specifically around mobile technology, like using apps. So this one, this slide was actually used, I think, in our webinar 2 weeks ago. So some of you might have seen this before, but I think it's quite interesting. This comes from McKinsey, so it's third-party data, but it basically shows that when you focus on different parts of the value chain and applying things like automation and technology, whether it's to back office processes like data entry, reporting, invoicing, or to the heart of field service when you look at things like how to be more predictive in your forecasting, how to better manage spare parts, specifically around things like shrinkage, lost items, theft, MTTR, better estimation accuracy when you're going to initially visit a client or a job site or doing a site survey, reducing SLA penalties. But then also the last kind of row here is quite interesting and often overlooked, which is the idea of how do you kind of convert what is historically viewed as a cost center into a potential revenue center, which is the idea of your field service technicians are your front line. They know your customers likely better than the rest of your company does, including even your marketing department, because they're talking to them day to day. They're seeing if they're happy or not. They're seeing how they're using your equipment and assets actually in real life on their sites. And it's a perfect opportunity to say, hey, okay, you bought this heating and cooling system, but we're noticing there's a lot of issues around your insulation, your windows, your ventilation. And, we have a partner company that we work with, and we'd be happy to bring someone here to actually have a look at that as well. And then maybe there's an upsell opportunity through your partner network on things that aren't even your core business around insulation that would complement the HVAC system that you might be maintaining. So, it's an easy way to turn this cost center into a profit center. So when you find ways to incorporate technology to help enhance that process, we normally expect to see 5 to 30% gains, basically in terms of savings over your operational costs. So whatever your OPEX is, you can basically reduce that on average 10 to 20% if this technology is properly applied throughout your operations. So, and all of these things become metrics, right? So how much did your MTTR improve? How much, what was the reduction in SLA penalties? How much did you reduce in staff training costs? What's your average return truck roll? Is it, was it 10% of jobs and now it's 5%? There's obviously costs associated to all of these, but you need to track those metrics and you need to have a baseline so you can start figuring out how to incorporate this technology and is there ROI on these types of investments, right? So here we go. So now, okay, this is a little bit management consulting-ish, but this kind of goes into that idea of continuous improvement and kind of a virtuous cycle here. So you really need to start here at kind of the top left with establishing KPIs and metrics. You need to have some level of baseline to make comparison to, right? If you don't have a baseline, it's really hard to say if you're doing well or not, right? And so you can start with nothing and your year one can kind of become your baseline for year two, but you need to make sure that data is being saved and it's being distributed across your organization so it can then be analyzed in comparison to the second year, right? Then based off of that, you can start doing things like forecasting and capacity planning. So do you need to scale up on a temporary workforce? Are you about to begin a huge rollout of smart meters in the next 3 months and you need to bring on 3 or 4 new subcontractors? How do you train them? What kind of equipment do they need? What kind of SLAs need to be in place? What kind of inventory do you need to hold? So it's much easier to do that when you have metrics from before, right? And then that gets into the idea of dynamic dispatching, which, this could be generic and just in terms of kind of how do you dispatch work in general, but in terms of field service, it could be more specific about how do you actually dispatch a task from a work order to a technician and doing it in the most dynamic fashion possible based off of that forecasting and capacity planning, based off of real-time data or changes, such as if somebody calls in sick or if you have an SLA that's, in danger of being breached. Doing that in a highly dynamic fashion that reacts to changes in the external environment. And then this is where the continuous improvement becomes interesting, is then you need to track that. And then you need to see what is working and what is not. It's all about making these micro adjustments to see that, okay, when we dispatched in a JIT fashion, we were able to reduce SLA breaches by 25%. When we were doing fully batch scheduling, we were missing a lot of things. So let's enhance the amount of, or let's kind of accelerate the JIT scheduling, maybe put the batch scheduling on the back burner, and then next week, let's test again. Next week, let's test again. And if something's not working, readjust. So it's kind of this idea of following an iterative approach. So this whole idea of continuous improvement, this really came from, it's about Kaizen, right? So this is all going back to kind of that post-World War II Japan and Toyota's manufacturing facilities. I'm sure a lot of you have heard of this. It was highly influential with things like the Lean Startup, written by Eric Race. It's very influential now in Silicon Valley in terms of following iterative approach to software development. But it doesn't have to solely lie in the realm of applications and software. It can also be, utilized like it originally was intended to be in operations. So it's this idea of kind of having this loop between establishing KPIs, making adjustments, tracking what's working and what's not, readjusting, and doing this continuously to constantly be driving towards, kind of the pursuit of perfection. So that's kind of how these metrics are intended to be used. So, here I'm going to actually skip to this one. So when we look at, what makes a good metric, there's another thing that you can probably find if you do research on the internet. It's fairly popular, called SMART. And what SMART stands for is being, first of all, specific. So you need to be specific in what you're measuring. It has to be clear. It can't be hazy about, okay, does this mean this or does it mean this? Everyone must agree on what does this data mean, right? Is it measurable? So it needs to be quantifiable. It's very hard to, run analysis on data that's not quantifiable. Or if it's qualitative, that's fine, but it needs to be qualitative in a way that it can be easily compared, right? So it needs to be quantifiable or measurable against set standards, right? Now, next is achievable. So it needs to be realistic. It needs to be fair, because what you don't want to do is pressure your organization, especially your frontline workers who are often quite busy, doing physical work, stressed out, dealing with a lot of last second issues, a lot of stress. You don't want to then pressure them with goals that aren't really achievable, because that's just going to make them want to give up. If they think, no matter what they do, they're going to fail, and they feel intense pressure, they're going to be unhappy at their job. They're going to be unhappy with your customers, and it's going to create, a negative cycle. So you want to set goals that motivate people to actually achieve them because they believe it is realistic, and then reward them for doing so, right? And then relevance. So whatever metrics you're tracking need to offer valuable insight into operational performance. So again, they need to not just be measurable and specific, but they need to be relevant to your business. And then timely. So you want data that's recent enough to actually hold relevance. So that connects back to the one above. You don't want to be looking at data from 2 to 3 years ago when your whole industry dynamics have changed. And it also needs to follow a regular schedule, right? There's no use in, setting certain KPIs and tracking them in month 1 and month 2, and then deciding not to do it, for the next 4 to 6 months, which means that all of a sudden it's a different season. You start tracking it again. You say, oh, wow, everything's gone down. Well, has it gone down because now it's winter and your business was seasonal, or maybe, traffic conditions are worse, so it's taking an extra hour for your technicians to arrive on site? It's hard to say unless you were tracking that same data last year during the winter season, and then you can actually look year on year, right? So that's kind of the idea of SMART. So if you come back here, so this is our slide. So SMART is taken from, the kind of the larger brain space of the internet. This is more from Zinier. So data needs to be measurable and actionable. That goes back to SMART, but it also needs to be focused around your people. It needs to be specific to your people. What do you care about? What is part of your company culture? What do you think will motivate your staff and your customers, right? And then it needs to align with the greater company goals. If you have OKRs in place, other type of strategic business objectives, maybe pressure coming in from your shareholders, how do you connect all of these things together, that your people are happy, your customers are happy, your business is happy, and what you're doing to ensure that is trackable, measurable, and relevant. So if we move forward, okay, so now we're getting into the heart of kind of this presentation here. So there's a lot of metrics. It's hard to categorize them per se. We tried to kind of go in and put them in buckets. So there's safety. That's pretty self-explanatory. There's quality. So the quality of the maintenance or the service that you're delivering. Productivity. So, how fast are you doing it? What is your utilization of your different technicians? Things like that. And then customer service, which goes into just general customer satisfaction. It also goes into technical support, things like implementation, etc. So there's a bit of crossover between these. It's a little bit gray, so you don't have to think of these as super static and fixed, but we're going to try to discuss these kind of box per box, one at a time. So quickly, if we just kind of like touch on safety here. So safety is an interesting one, which is very often overlooked, right? So safety metrics, it's a bit hard, and there's not really a clear and fast rule of what metrics should be used for safety. With COVID-19, obviously PPE, the need to have masks, etc., has brought safety way more into the light than it normally is. Unfortunately, it's often ignored until something disastrous happens, until there's injuries, traffic accidents, an explosion, etc. Now, some ways to kind of get around this. So here, I'll skip down to the safety slide here. There's, normally people start with lagging indicators. So a lagging indicator could be like incidents, or near misses. So basically near incidents. This is a great starting point. You can see that something did happen, what led up to that happening, what was the result of that happening, and now how can we try to put new standards in place or policies in place to prevent that from happening again. So this is good, but it's a lagging indicator, right? So it's bad things that have already happened, but how do you help prevent new things and new threats from happening in the future, right? So more leading indicators would be things like inspections, audits completed. So, do you have random inspections on your sites? If technicians are doing work on a cell site, you occasionally send somebody there to make sure that they have, for instance, their fall retention equipment on, that they have safety helmets on, and that they're following best practices. And how many of those audits were completed? How many of those were passes? How many of those were fails? Another one is corrective actions. So, if it was noted that something is unsafe, that maybe something is lacking electrical integrity, that there's not, a fire extinguisher in the facility, what corrective actions do you take? How do you remediate it? How do you note it down that it's been remediated? How do you sometimes mildly punish or penalize someone for breaking these things? And taking a note and keeping a record of those corrective actions taken, and then comparing that to things like incidents and inspections and audits completed, right? Then there's other things as well. Like if you have fleet management technology, you can track things like speeding, routes taken, etc. So, I think the importance of this is fairly obvious. Like nobody wants their teams to be injured, but there's also the fallout to your brand with customers, negative media, and other things. So for instance, in Africa, if you take this as a use case, most of the tower companies and the telecom operators, so the mobile network operators, they're using a workforce that does not have insurance. So they're completely uninsured. But what happens is that the regulators in many large countries in Africa will come in and they will punish directly the company. So if you have a technician that's climbing up a tower to do work on an antenna, and that person fails to put on their fall retention equipment and falls, God forbid, and potentially dies, not only is that horribly tragic and sad, and now you have to deal with all the fallout with the family, the loss of morale with the rest of your team, any negative media coverage, but normally there will be a direct fine from the regulator that's usually around 7 figures. So you're looking at an immediate hit of 7 figures just because that happened. So it's critically important, not just from the personal and emotional point of view, but also from a raw, cold financial point of view, to really take these things into account. How do you ensure that the people have their fall retention gear? What kind of technology do you have in place that enforces best practices to ensure that the people are safe before they do something like enter a hazardous site or climb up a tall cell tower or do work on, electricity lines, et cetera. Then there's also a loss in productivity, right? So it's, you can see here at the top, in the US, they face 62 billion in lost productivity per year due to injuries. So people that just simply can't work, or they're working but far, far less efficiently than normal because they're injured, right? So, there's again the emotional part, but there's also the cold financial part as well. So this is just in the US, 62 billion in losses every year. So it's very important to figure out metrics to also think about safety, which again is often overlooked. Now, when we get into things that are less overlooked, we start getting into kind of the heart of field service, which are things like first time fix rate, service level agreements, compliance, uptime versus downtime. So if you look kind of at this chart here, you can see things that lead to workflow pitfalls and reduction in first time fix rates and things like that. So a lot of times it's simply just inaccurate and incomplete job data. So you have a work order come out, you don't know exactly what asset you're supposed to be working on. You don't have visibility over the history of that asset. You go to do work on it, you realize, this isn't the right thing. I don't even have the right tools. I need to check the integrity of the network first before I can do work on this BTS, and I didn't bring the device. So now I have no way of checking if it's been improved. Or I needed a ladder and I didn't bring the ladder. Now I need to go back. Why didn't my work order tell me that I was going to be working at height? Okay. So there's a lot of things that lead to reduction in first time fix rate, but there's not many things more important than first time fix rate. So the worst thing you can do is basically have downtime, which means that maybe a cell tower that's generating $100,000 a day, which is right in the heart of a dense city, goes down. Every hour counts, every minute counts. So if you send someone there hoping to resolve it in the next hour, they realize they don't have the right equipment, they need to call somebody else. That person's stuck in traffic delivering the equipment. When they get there, it takes them a while to troubleshoot. All of a sudden, 1 hour becomes 6 hours. That could be 50, 60K in lost revenue. Now, if you have 150 of those critical nodes throughout a country, and this is happening on a daily basis, it can be a big problem, right? So looking at uptime, equipment uptime, normally you're looking at SLAs around uptime that are usually 97 to 99%. So it's quite intense. It's quite competitive. It really demands efficiency in operations. And it's not just about if you're the one delivering on those SLAs. It's also about if you're the one creating the SLAs. How do you create fairer SLAs? How do you ensure that they're being met and that they're actually realistic? How do you know that if somebody's reporting they were there on time and complied with the SLA, how do you know that they were actually there? This is where technology comes into play, because it's very hard to track metrics and try to make improvements if you can't trust, the efficacy of these metrics, right? And so this is kind of where technology also comes into play in terms of validating if somebody was actually there or not, if the percentage is actually real or not, right? So moving along, then we get into productivity. So again, there's some crossover between quality and productivity, but productivity is more about how fast did you get something done? How optimal, how efficient was it? So mean time to repair is probably the golden metric here, MTTR. So sometimes people call this mean time to recovery, mean time to complete. It kind of depends on the asset that you're working on, but normally MTTR is kind of the standard. This is basically what was the average time to fix something. So, the faster, the better, the smaller, the better. So if you look at things like MTTR, this is about actually doing the work. It's this 33% here, which is the heart of field service technicians' work. But there's a lot of things, before and after in the value chain that can affect it, especially primarily before. Things like driving time, the routes taken, correct work order data, having the necessary access data to get into a site, making sure that the client's there when you need the client to be there. All of this can lead to reductions in MTTR. Now, going hand in hand with this is things like technician utilization rates. So are you overutilizing certain people and then being charged overtime for that, while other technicians are being idle? Maybe there's an idle technician that's closer in terms of proximity to a site that maybe is not quite as experienced as the other technician, but is more than enough to get the job done. Why not dispatch that technician and get there 2 hours earlier, right? What you don't want is to be paying like on guesstimates of work that might be, this job is going to take us 40 hours. The job actually only takes 30 hours. And then you're paying not only for 10 extra hours of work that's not being done, but those technicians are also just being idle because they're just maybe sitting around on the job site, hanging out, having food, when they could actually be doing something else productive. So things like utilization rates, idleness is very important. And then leakages. So when we talk about leakages, there's different types of leakages. There's warranty leakages. There's parts and inventory leakages. And then there's other types as well, but these are kind of the classic two. Now, when you look at warranty leakages, this is an interesting one. So this is the idea that if you have a warranty in place with a client or a service agreement in place with a client, and then you go out to do work, that should be covered in the agreement. They should already be paying for that. Usually it's some kind of recurring, OpEx format. However, it's very frequent that because technicians are so busy, because there's so much data getting pulled back and forth, they don't know exactly what the model of a given asset is, or they don't have updated contract information about the client when they arrive on site, that they'll actually do work that's outside of that warranty, right? Or a warranty that's already expired. And so you're basically working for free, and nobody likes to do that. Now, then you also have inventory shrinkage as well. So that goes into the leakages around parts and inventory. So this is like things like lost items on site, wasting consumables by maybe taking too many items to site that are unnecessary, and shrinkage, right? Theft, things like that. So this means you need to monitor your warehouses better. You need to monitor your parts and inventory. Maybe you need barcode scanners or QR code scanners. So on every item that gets checked out, it gets scanned in, and then that's compared to the work order and what was the estimated goods that need to be utilized for that job, and do they match up? So this goes back kind of into that capacity planning we saw there in the in that continuous improvement cycle, right? So it's all about productivity in the end of the day, and solutions like ours are really designed to enhance productivity. So it means, how do you cut down on non-value adding things like driving time, making an invoice after the fact, reporting to management, customer absence? How do you basically take that non-33%, that other kind of 67% of the square, and squash it down to make that purple part as big as possible, right? So that's kind of what our technology was to do. Now, last but not least, customer service. So again, this one is a bit generic. It doesn't necessarily just apply to field service. but it should definitely be looked at for field service because it's pretty critical. This is how that last part that we showed in the slide about increasing customer satisfaction, this is how you track it, right? So there's different ways to do this. So kind of the classic is NPS, which is Net Promoter Score. So Net Promoter Score is normally it takes its face through a questionnaire. So through something like, how likely are you to recommend us to a friend or colleague, right? It's normally on a scale of 0 to 10, 0 to 6. So 0 is the worst, 10 is the best. 0 to 6 would be considered a detractor. 7 to 8 would be neutral, and it doesn't really count. And then 9 to 10 would be considered a promoter, which is obviously what you want, which means that your customer would recommend you to a friend. So then what you do to calculate the percentage is you take your percentage of detractors, you take your percentage of promoters, and then you remove the neutrals. And then you basically subtract promoters from detractors to arrive at a final percentage, right? And so that kind of tells you how, not just if a customer was happy with, one act of service, but if they're so happy with you overall as a brand, with repeat services over the history of their interaction with your company, that they would actually say, yeah, I would recommend this to my mother, I would recommend this to my colleagues, which is really what you want. And that's how you grow your business, right? Now, CSAT is very closely related to this. So that's customer satisfaction. But it doesn't necessarily focus so much on loyalty via recommendations. It's more about examining it's like a microcosm, where you would look at one specific service incident, where you would look at one contact with maybe technical support, and you would use that individual contact and drive metrics from that and say, okay, how happy were you with your service today, right? And then you would take the sum of all of those surveys. Maybe it's a 0 to 10 scale. There's different ways to do it. Sometimes it's happy faces, sad faces, and you press a button. You'll see that like in bathroom facilities at airports. But you would basically take the total sum possible, which would be all 10s, let's say, in a 1 to 10 use case. And then you would take whatever scores you received from all of those different customers, and you would take your received scores, divide it by the total sum possible, and then multiply that by 100 to arrive at a percentage, right? And so obviously the more data points you have, the better. But it's quite interesting because unlike Net Promoter Score, you can drill down and you can say like one specific type of technical support request. When somebody maybe is logged out and can't change their password. One type of service incident where somebody's going to install a smart meter, or when somebody needs to go and fix, I don't know, a Caterpillar generator, and then you can look at, okay, so what parts of my service organization seem to be exceeding customers' expectations? What parts are kind of mediocre and what parts are bad? And let me go build a training plan to help remediate the parts that are bad. Let me take some of the best practices from the parts that are exceeding expectations, and then, kind of let that spill over into the neutral part of my business. And you can start, trying to raise the bar across the board, right? So, that's a little bit about CSAT. And then there's attachment rate as well, which is a cool one. This kind of goes back to warranty leakage. It's basically the percentage of product sales transactions that include a service contract added on at the point of sale. So this is, a great way to increase revenue. And it's a great way to take something that might be a CapEx and add on an OpEx component to it, where, okay, we've sold you this asset, but, we can increase, the usable life of this asset by maybe 33% by adding on the service contract. And it's going to be far cheaper than you having to do individual one-off calls when you have a failure. So, let me show you what that looks like, have a look at it. And then, if you want, you can sign off right now, or we can contact you tomorrow and whatever. So is a great way to increase revenues, right? So that's known as attach rate. And then you have things that are more simple, like cross-sell, upsell, and then things like retention, right? What are your retain rates? Not just for your customers, but also for your staff. How are you checking that your staff's happy? Are they enjoying their work? Do they think they're fairly paid? Are they well trained? Do they have, chances for camaraderie in and amongst themselves? Or are they stuck in an island, right? So retention is also quite important. So now we basically covered those 4 buckets. So that was kind of a lot to take in. I feel like I've been talking a lot. And last webinar I did together with my colleague Gonzalo, so it's all me talking this time. Now we're almost done. So, and then we're going to hand it over to some questions at the end. But we wanted to take a real life example of a client that we've been working with at Zinier, and just kind of show how, through technology, you can sort of, move the meter on some of these different metrics, right? So this client here, this use case that we're showing is a company called Black & Veatch. Black & Veatch is a large EPC, so engineering and procurement and construction company from the US. They're actually based in the heart of America in Kansas City, which is oddly enough where I'm from as well, but not connected. They about 3.7 billion in annual revenue, so quite a large company, all over the world, active in civil construction, power plants, telecom. Telecom is probably their strongest overall vertical. They're usually, often number one in ENR top 50 for telecom. So they've been involved in large-scale rollouts of fiber networks in the U.S. So working with all the big telecom operators there, doing a great job. But some of the challenges they were facing were things like the Uberization of their workforce. How do we quickly scale up and scale down based off the projects? What if we just want temporary workers? And what if we start bringing in these younger guys that are used to working in a totally different way, that don't have the knowledge base of our industry veterans? How do we quickly gear them up and get them following best practices? And is there a way that we can do that through technology? So this was part of it, more related to kind of the initial increase in kind of rollout and maintenance of these fiber networks. But where the real gains were seen, which is pretty interesting, was actually not in the field, but in the back office. So I was actually talking to kind of our head of customer success the other day about this specific client. So basically, you're seeing here that there was 3 times more jobs closed out per day by the back office. So basically, on average, this company was seeing around 100 documents per day that they had to process in the back office related to the projects that we at Zinier were focused on with Black & Veatch in the US. Now, on average, they're spending, so our goal was to reduce the time per document by 15 minutes. Now, if you look at around $80,000 a year is the median salary for most of these people in the US. So that's about $10. So per every 15-minute optimization. So that's $1,000 a day if you do the math, and 1,500 minutes saved per day. Now, if there's 260 working days in a year, you times that by $1,000 a day. Well, the math is pretty simple. It's $260,000 saved annually. And that's only on document processing by the back office. And it's only for one part of their business. So you're dealing with just the US, one segment of their business, just for document processing, and you're saving $260,000 annually. And this is something that most companies might not even look at. They just think, okay, this is our closing out process. We collect the data we need to collect. We report to the municipality. We invoice. We make sure our contractors get paid. It works. Yes, it does work, but maybe you're actually losing $260,000 a year, and you could free up 1,500 minutes a day of some of these people's time so they can do other things that add increased value to your business. And what that also means is that since you're getting it done faster, there's faster billing cycles. So you're also cutting down day sales outstanding, right? Your DSO. And this was basically done, I think we have a slide for it, through these things. But part of it was automated scheduling and tracking through recommendations. So this goes more into how to manage that kind of subcontracted and fluid workforce. And the standardization of not only the work orders, but the mobile checklists to make sure that these kind of temporary workers are armored or empowered with the knowledge they need to increase their first time fix rates and mean time to resolutions. But it was really about the ability to, and I don't even know if we clearly even have it listed in this slide, but what it really is about is to take those mobile checklists and then to compile them automatically into detailed closeout reports, or what we call closeout packages, which are then pushed to the back office in a standardized format. So it's super easy to see what was done, if it was done correctly or not, so they can close it out. So that was kind of how we used, rather simple technology solutions to really drive impact for this business. So what? Last but not least, what's the point? What does it all mean? I hope I kind of touched on that already in the presentation, but just to drill it home, here's something from Deloitte. So I'll just read this. Every day, approximately 20 million field service workers are spread across the globe. They're interacting closely with an organization's most important assets, which are its customers and its products. Yet, most of what happens at that critical interface is actually disconnected from the core business. So even with the latest and greatest in technology and management techniques, management still often operates without real clear line of sight into how to improve their financial data and customer results, because so much of that key situational data is just in the heads of the field workers, right? They know that the customer is not happy. They know why the customer is not happy, but they don't have time or a communication medium to necessarily push that back up to management. Nor do they even want to. Maybe they think that it will result in them getting lectured or fired, right? So it's a tragedy to let so much valuable operational data just sit in the head of your field workers. That should be, pumped in to systems, to dashboards. It should be compared over historical data and used to constantly, in a continuous improvement model, optimize your operations. So basically, with each service call, instead of companies losing valuable information, they should be gaining valuable information. So how do you break the data silo? So, briefly to plug our company, this is an example of some of our dashboards, but it's important to have the ability to build customized dashboards to track the actual metrics you want to track, and to be able to modify and update those as those metrics change, right? To have historical data that you can look at, day on day, technician by technician, or vendor per vendor, to set kind of global KPIs across your vendors, right? And so the thing is, about this, like, I think everyone knows data is important, dashboards are important. But one of the issues is that so much of it's siloed, right? So you have maybe a lot of customer information coming into technical support that's kind of sitting there with technical support. You have field data that's staying in the heads of your field technicians. You have back office coordinators that are primarily focused on invoicing and reports. Then you have your kind of fleet management and dispatching team that's mainly just looking at, GPS data and real-time data of where the trucks are and the trucks' health and maintenance cycles. But how do you begin to consolidate that together to see synergies or patterns across the board? That maybe, the issue of a faulty truck is resulting in delays to arrive on site, which is making your client upset, which is reducing your NPS score, et cetera, right? And it's only when you start to connect it together and break down those data silos that you can start making the necessary improvements across your business to really drive, growth and bottom line profitability. So, all right, that was more or less it. So as key takeaways, I'll just kind of quickly go through these. As field service executives, we know that you want to increase your service margins. You want to increase the capacity for new customers at a lower operational cost. So taking into account customer acquisition costs, and increase your customer satisfaction. I think these things are fairly, indisputable, right? Field service metrics should be focused on data that is measurable and actionable, but it also should be relevant to your people and to your greater company goals. So that's again, very, very simple, but important to take in mind at the very beginning when you start setting these metrics. And make sure that, you're taking into account metrics across the board, not just productivity, not just quality, but safety, customer service, and looking at it all together in aggregate to see how they're connected to one another. And so that transitions into 4, break down those data silos, leverage data across your organization, and take a performance-centric approach. And then kind of follow this plan, do, act, measure, continuous improvement approach, which here we call identify, measure, evaluate, iterate, which is really the same thing if we come back to that very first slide there with W. Edward Deming from the first slide. So that sums it up for me. Thank you all for your time. We're going to hand it over for about 10 minutes of Q&A here at the end, which Katerina will moderate. But again, my email is here, so if any of you have questions, if you want to talk about specific use cases or metrics that you're trying to improve or struggling to track or anything else, or want to understand better how technology and automation could potentially be utilized to help move the dial for your organization, reach out. My email is right there, so I would be more than happy to chat with you.
Well, thank you very much, Michael. So as Michael said, we will go ahead and take some time for questions now. We have 10 minutes. Okay, so the first question we have is, how can a telecom company use technology to improve first-time fix rate?
Okay, how can a technology company utilize? Okay, so there's various ways, right? So, so again, actually, I would say first and foremost, it's understanding more about the asset, right? So if you have, for instance, IoT devices on your asset and you're getting information in real time about that asset, you can basically start shifting towards predictive maintenance and saying, okay, we probably need to go out there because it's going to fail in a month. But you need to ensure that your technician, when that work order is created, has visibility over the asset history of that asset as well, so they know what previous work was done. Even simple things like a lock that needs to be opened. do they have access to that lock? And sometimes they change the locks. They do work on an asset, they change the lock, and then a technician arrives, he can't even open a cabinet to do work on a BTS. So you need to have that asset visibility first and foremost. It needs to be tied to the work order. It needs to be transmitted to the technician when that ticket is dispatched. So that's first and foremost. And then it's also taking things into account like proximity, right? You need to make sure that it's the closest technician to the job, but also the most skilled technician for that job, so that when that person, gets there, they can actually get the work done and get it done fast and on time with the right equipment, with the asset history, with everything they need there, right? So I think, the easiest way for a telecom company or otherwise to start leveraging technology to increase their FTFR is simply to make sure that all of the necessary, actually here, we had a slide about it. This one, I think. If you see 51% when you look at these field service workflow pitfalls, it's just simply because of inaccurate or incomplete job data around a work order. So I feel like my answer is a little bit too basic, but I'm sticking with it because, again, 51% of issues actually just come from the work order not being fully filled out and technicians arriving on site without the information they need to remediate a problem, right? So if you really want to increase FTFR, it starts with having the right data before you go to site.
Okay, so the second question is, what about when you have many different vendors or contractors? How does that affect the complexity of targeting these metrics?
Okay, that's a good question. So yeah, of course, if that adds a whole other layer of complexity, because then you're tracking metrics, across vendors, and one vendor might be performing, better than they were 6 months ago, but they're still underperforming against another vendor, right? So, I think, a big part of that is you need to, again, set global KPIs. So you need to look at all of your data from your different vendors in aggregate, and then take similar job types and say that, okay, on average, it's taking, vendor A 1 hour to complete, refueling, a petrol station pump, for instance, or, refueling the genset, the backup generator on a site. But it's taking, vendor B only 20 minutes, and then it's taking vendor C 4 hours. Okay, so it seems like vendor B is the best because they're only taking 20 minutes. But if you go to check some of those sites, you might find that they're actually not changing the oil, and they're actually just faking it, right? So the first thing you need to do is figure out which data is real and accurate. And then you need to look at maybe vendor A and C. Okay, vendor C was changing it, but it was taking 4 hours. Vendor A was changing it, but taking 1 hour. Okay, vendor C doesn't count. We're writing that off. So we're getting rid of them. So it looks like 1 hour is sort of the benchmark for this. So then when you bring in new vendors, you can set 1 hour as your SLA or as the benchmark, and then see how they're performing. And if they're able to go under that, then okay, now you can you can raise the bar to 45 minutes, for instance. But you need to first take the same type of task, start tracking it, make sure that that data is accurate, that people aren't forging the data, and then start figuring out what is the best overall average, setting that as a benchmark, and then using that as a global KPI. But to do that, you need the ability to have data silos broken down with global dashboards where you can track across your organization and across vendors, and take that into account every week. So you're not just tracking across the organization, but you're also going deeper and tracking it across your vendors. And that's going to help you make fair SLAs. It's going to cut costs with your managed service providers, and just drive overall value to your business.
Okay, perfect, Michael. The third one we have is how to take general customer-based metrics such as NPS and CSAT and determine the weight of field service on that metric.
Okay, well, that's a very good one. Okay, so I think it's really in how you ask the question, right? So CSAT is probably a better example because CSAT can be more specific. It would be things like at the point of service delivery, actually having the customer. So basically Uberizing the whole thing, right? Where you can rate your trip. And so you want to rate your service, rate your technician. So it's kind of that idea of, right when the service has been delivered, give the customer a chance to voice feedback. And then that feedback is specifically around that service. And then again, one data point means nothing. Do that for that same incident. Make sure that this is built into a workflow so that you have some kind of standardized workflow. So these are the things you can do with technologies like Zinier. You can build standardized checklists and then modify and tweak those checklists for that type of job. And every one of these jobs should end with a customer survey to monitor satisfaction. You can do that for 3 months. And then you can go and start checking the data. And then you can compare that to your overall CSAT score or your overall NPS score. And then you can look at the variance, right? Because it's very important that you're collecting points from all the different parts of your service delivery organization, all the way from, customer ticket resolution times, how fast are calls picked up, attrition rates, et cetera, and then compare that to your actual service that's being delivered in the field. And you can see, okay, where are the issues? If CSAT is super high, in the field, because you're capturing that at the point of service delivery, but super low with technical support. Well, you don't want to blame your service technicians for that. And you don't want to reprimand them and change all of your processes and assume that you have a serious problem and get rid of your field service director and change your operations team when the problem's actually rooted in how you're managing support tickets, right? So I think it's very important that you collect data also at the point of service delivery, and then you always compare that to the larger scale kind of macroeconomic view to try to identify the variance. All right, thanks everybody. Have a happy Wednesday. Thanks, Katerina.